Appreciate everyone coming back. I forgot to mention on part one, in the lower right corner, there's a Wheels of Time magazine. I wrote a two-part article on the W900. This is May and June. This is part two. The March-April 2020 issue had carried part one. May and June 2020 had part two. Some of what are on these slides are included in that article. Some material that's in the article isn't on the slides. Article's a little more detailed as far as the changes. If I went through every change that they made, I'd need to live here in Reno because we'd constantly be going over it, trying to cover them all. But if any of this is of interest to you and you don't have those two issues, try to get them. They have a lot of good information in them. I did a lot of research, worked really hard putting those together. So those two articles, so watch for those magazines. So now we'll start into part two. If you remember at the end of part one, we had gone to paddle style door latches with the -276 series cab. And we're going to just stop counting generations because the cab structure stayed the same from the third generation to the paddle style door latches. If you want to be technical, that was the fourth generation cab. But we had just done that and we had the 1972 models out. So let's start looking at 1973 and see what we've got going on. 1973, Kenworth had been in operation for 50 years. This year we're celebrating the 100th anniversary of Kenworth. 1973 was 50 years ago. They celebrated their 50th anniversary. Much the same as this year, they had lots of special activities that took place. They made some special trucks. Here in the center is a special show truck that they built for taking to trade shows with this special paint design. They made a K100, an L700, possibly some construction trucks that all had this same paint design, the red, gold, and white with that same design on it. This was most likely maybe the Anaheim, California Truck Show, 1973. In May 1973, they had their annual dealer meeting and they called it the Golden Review. And that was kind of special because they let each dealer order a special truck and it would be at this dealer meeting. They could go and see their truck that they had ordered. These four W900s here, they're all blue W900s, but it shows one end of the spectrum to the other of what a W900 could be. You got the S12 on this side with spoke wheels. You've got a really nice W900 in the middle, standard W900 in the middle with 11/24/5 Alcoas on it, two exhausts. Then you got a pretty plain W900 with the spoke wheels on the front, 5 spoke wheels on the front, and a big far air cleaner. And then beside it, you got kind of a standard W900 sleeper truck. Each one of those was for a different dealer, and they had 50, 60 trucks in this Coliseum here, and each one was for a different dealer, and that was the dealer meeting for 1973. You see here on the very right corner, there's an L700, the pickup delivery truck, barely poking out, and it's painted the same way as this W900 show truck here in the front. 1973 was a really popular year. They were producing trucks at all-time highs. They were selling trucks quicker than they could build them. May 1973, they set an all-time production record of 534 trucks. That's a lot of trucks rolling out of the factory in a 30-day period. They ran 2 shifts during that time, and any way they could make a truck come off the line a little quicker, they did it. Quality wasn't compromised, but that was their thing, balance quality with efficiency as far as turning them out as quickly as we can. you see an awful lot of 1973 model Kenworths, and that's why their dealership system had expanded throughout the country, and everybody wanted a Kenworth in 1973. To celebrate that, they had a redesigned emblem. As you can see, these up through 1972, they had the 4 raised bars, 2 raised circles, concentric circles, and the script style lettering. 1973, they simplified it, streamlined it, block style lettering, and to celebrate the 50th anniversary, they called it gold plated. They were essentially a different metal other than gold, obviously something a lot cheaper, brass, but they were gold plated emblems on the front and on the side. The actual Kenworth nameplate on the side was gold as well. It was redesigned, and the emblem change was pretty much January 1st, 1973. Shortly after January, the trucks built shortly after January 1st had the new emblem. And when you look at a chassis record on a 73 model truck, it'll have the part number for this emblem, and then it'll have a narrative under it. Gold plated celebrating Kenworth's 50th anniversary on every chassis record. After this in 73, they retained the same emblem but left the gold plating off, and that emblem ran from 74 and up. Another big change in 1970, from 72 to 73, is from 68 to 72, they had this style neck. The cap, the rubber stopper type cap that goes in and you twist it and it expands, they call that a thermos style cap. They had those which worked good, but there was some issue with being in an accident and the neck being sheared off. So once again, the Federal Highway Administration mandated that they reduce the protrusion, recess the cap. So that's what they did in 1973. Trucks built after January 1st, 1973 received this new style cap, and it actually went in and turned. You had 2 tabs that locked in the casting, and then you twisted it to tighten it up. So it was a thermos style with a lock that was much more secure than the 72 and before style tanks. These ran from 73 through 79. 79, we got the screw-on caps, which we still have today. On the inside of the cab, they had quite a few changes. There was a technical school, I believe they were in North Carolina, that did studies on ways to produce machines to give operators less fatigue while operating them, industrial machines. Kenworth contracted with them to help them lay out their dash so it was less driver fatigue, easy to see, and controls were grouped together where you would generally find them on other manufacturers. That was called the RCCC design. 72, switches were at the top, gauges were below, key switch was in the panel with the switches. Wipers were up on top of the dash. I guess they thought if you were looking at your wiper, you would see the wiper control. In 73, that was all moved down. The dash was just completely redesigned for 73, and it would essentially stay this way throughout production, this part of the dash anyway. But that was to meet the recommendations, the RCCC recommendations. K100s did that at the same time as well, and they're known as the RCCC style dash. Another thing that is not really widely known, but certainly worth mentioning, was in about 1970, 69, 70, Alice Chalmers wanted to enter the heavy truck engine market, and they came up with their 21,000, 25,000 series engines. The 25,000 was the big engine, and it produced 450 horsepower at 2,100 RPM, and all of these required the cab to be set back 12 inches. They also painted their engines purple. They said that would celebrate the sex appeal of the engine, and I will leave your imaginations to what the mechanics actually referred to that sex appeal as. But Most of them failed and were replaced with an 855 Cummins or a Caterpillar 1693 somewhere throughout their lifespan. There are a few of these that survive, but they're quite rare. But it required the cab to be set back 12 inches as well, and Kenworth actually promoted these in the early 70s as a big horsepower engine that was readily available, because Caterpillar couldn't produce 1693s and Cummins couldn't produce NTC 350s fast enough to meet the demand for them, and they advertised that they wanted people to sell these Alice Chalmers because that was a big horse engine that was already there and readily available. The interiors, 1973 and before, the nice interior was known as a Splendor. You had your choice of 4 colors: regal red, brown, black, and fern green. And then you could either get it solid, or they would do the accents in the seats, which you see here on the left, in what was called autumn smoke. The headliner was autumn smoke in all of these trucks, and then the accent stripes in the seats would be autumn smoke, kind of an off-white color. And this was 1973 and before. Midway through 1974, they completely overhauled the color choices, eliminated the two-tone styles, and they gave you 8 choices instead of 4. Right here on the left, you see the 8 new colors. These actually were the VIT colors for the cabovers that had gone over quite well, and they simply decided they would make these the standard colors for Splendor as well, do away with the autumn smoke. And as you can see, you could get black, blue, walnut, rawhide, crimson, wheat, parchment, or cactus green. This green's somewhat darker. The crimson's somewhat darker than the other green, than the other regal red on the 73 and earlier trucks. That happened partway through 1973. Partway through 1974. At the beginning of 1974, though, they changed their gauge styles. 73 and back, they had used the simple Stewart Warner heavy-duty series gauges with chrome bezels. 1974, they started with what was known as a bi-torque. These were specifically for Kenworth. They were supposed to be more accurate, have a better suited sweep of travel for their application for trucks and their engines that they had. 74 and up used the bi-torque, all the way up, used the bi-torque with chrome bezels. So with these changes, particularly the Splendor interior, they overhauled the way that they priced their trucks and sold their trucks. This occurred with the July 1974 edition of the price book. They dropped the submodels. Prior to July 74, you had a separate price for a 921, 923, 924, 925. After that, they were all simply a W900 series, and there was one price, and you added your options that you wanted a la carte. You could add options to the submodels, but you had a base set of options that it started with, a base set of specifications that it started with. At the same time, there was a lot of confusion that had been generated about year models. As we talked about earlier, the year the truck was actually titled as opposed to when it was built. So July 1974, they set the year models at the factory, and anything produced after September 1st was the following year model. Simple things like the single headlights had been standard with dual optional prior to 1974. After that, dual headlights became standard and single were optional. The narrow grille and 1200-inch radiator was standard before. The wide grille and 1400 radiator was standard afterwards. We talked about the colored choices. They upgraded the engine a little bit, and in all of this confusion, what they were actually trying to do is the standard truck went from $28,310 to $33,470. That was a big, big deal in 1974 of how ridiculous Kenworth was hiking the prices of their trucks. You didn't see that many late 74 trucks because of this reason. Right at the end of 74, production kind of ramped up because the dual brake system, anti-lock brake system was coming in the 1st of 75. That was going to jack the price of trucks up even more. A few people got in on this. So you saw production really start slowing down, sales really start slowing down after that banner year of 73. Also in 73, 74, you started getting some higher horsepower, different design engines. Late 73, Caterpillar had the 3406 in slow production. They were starting to turn them out. Cummins was also experimenting with the KT series, KT 450, and they had one that was called a KTA that they didn't even put a horsepower rating on. They just wanted to get them out and test them. In order to fit these in standard hood trucks, they went back to what they had done with the 1693, and they put a deeper firewall, a deeper doghouse in the firewall, fiberglass again. The one here in the center is what a 3406 doghouse looks like. You can see there's a formed aluminum channel brace above it to support that wide area. Notice it's much wider than the 1693 opening is. That's to fit, to be able to get the head off of a 3406. Then on the right, you've got the KT 450 recess. It's even deeper than the 3406 was, has the same brace across the top, the formed aluminum brace across the top. This was so they could fit those big engines in standard hood trucks and sell them all the way across the country, because they already had learned their lesson with the cab set back 12 inches before, trying to sell on the East Coast where the length laws were quite strict. The engines that had to have the long hood were, as we talked before, the Allis-Chalmers 2500, the 1693 between 64 and 71, 3408, which came into being after 1974, and then the Cummins KTA 525 and 600. I will note here that there are indeed a few after-cooled KT series in standard hood trucks. I only know of one, which was a test engine that Shute Brothers in Greeley, Colorado had, that was a 600 horsepower after-cooled in a standard hood. Once they got through with the testing, I have never seen a record for a truck with an after-cooled KT in a standard hood. There are plenty of them out there. Look up the record and it says it came with a KT 450, not an after-cooled. If you have one, I'd be glad to hear about it, and I will make note of it. I'll look up the record and make note of it, but as of this point, I've looked up dozens of KTA engines in standard hood trucks. Not a single one came with a KTA. And then, of course, the Detroit 12E71. If you didn't want the doghouse, you could get a long hood with a 1693 after 1971 with a 3406 and with the KT 450. If you've ever driven one of these trucks with a doghouse in it, the accelerator pedal is moved back a little bit and it's a little bit cramped. And if you weren't particularly concerned with length, oftentimes you'd get the long hood and not have the doghouse, so you'd have a little more room in the cab. Not everyone did that, so you see them both ways. The engine on the right, you see both ways. On the left, you see it this way. And I'd also say that through the time period that we're covering here, the long hood was not an option except for those. It was included with the price on these engines. Whenever you bought a 3408, when you paid the list price, and we'll show that in a few minutes, when you paid the list price, that included the long hood. You didn't have to order the hood separately. On a 1693, if you wanted a long hood, you simply wrote long hood on the order sheet. It didn't cost anything. It was the same price whether you had a long hood or you had a doghouse inside. That's going to change a little bit later, but as far as right here, that's the way they price things. Spring 1974, the K100 VIT had already been in production for roughly 3 years, a little over 3 years. And they had seen where there was a market for a W900 version of that VIT. That was a very nice interior, larger sleeper, just a premium truck. As you can see here, they introduced the walk-in opening so you could actually walk from the cab into the sleeper without having to crawl through that little hole. At the same time, they had high back seats. They had this diamond interior. Inside the sleeper, there were clothes closets, and it was, if you had a VIT, you really had something. Unfortunately, they sort of jumped the gun because they got the trucks ready to build and they couldn't quite build them then. So they were introduced in the spring of '74. It took them to the spring of '75 to actually start turning them out in any number. There's a sprinkling of '74, '75 model trucks, VITs, but not very many at all. Here in the lower right corner, you can see the heat air conditioning unit and the plywood floor. Even the VIT had a plywood floor in it, just like the 36-inch sleeper did. Among the first 5 VITs they built were 2 pretty famous ones that sort of really spurred the VIT movement. Those were built for the NBC TV show Moving On. As far as I can tell, this is either the second and third or third and fourth VITs that were built. The initial ones had VT903, 350 horsepower engines, torsion bar suspension, and something that they featured was this new gull wing bumper. Prior to these 2 trucks, the gull wing bumper had never existed. The employees at Seattle plant hand built these bumpers to make the VITs a little special, put them on these trucks. When the TV show came out, Kenworth started getting letters from truck owners, where can I get that bumper that's on Sonny Pruitt's truck? So they discovered there's a market here, and 6 or so months after the show debuted, they started making that bumper available on their new trucks or available through parts. But prior to the VIT, there was no gull wing bumper, and this bumper that you're looking at right here was a hand-built aluminum gull wing bumper. After the show, the initial filming was done, Kenworth bought these 2 trucks back, provided them with 2 new trucks that had NTC 350s. Can't imagine why they would do that. And Kenworth retained the 2 903 trucks for display purposes, and they'd take them to open houses around, and you can look back through some of the old flyers and magazine articles, and dealers will advertise that they're going to have the moving on truck in for some open house. One of these 2 903 trucks is what Kenworth was generally sending for that. The construction trucks, as we looked at in part 1, that was something they were really focusing on, was the construction market. So back in 1972, they came up with this truck here known as the Brute. It was so different, they didn't even give it a regular model number. It was just called a Brute. The steering axle was set back, what was considered radically at the time. And you can see the hood design was quite different than anything else they were building in 1972, but it featured straight frame rails. And that allowed you to put a mixer drive on the front. That allowed for much heavier steering axle loading. They put 24,000-pound steering axles on these trucks, and they held up fine. The cab was raised up. There were many little changes, but they retained the straight frame like they were using on the W900. I guess they had enough of the variable section frame with the C800 series. But these replaced essentially all of the construction trucks in 1972. The Brute did, and the new C500. C500 in 1972-73 looked like this truck here on the left. Looked an awful lot like a W900 S12. However, straight frame rails, didn't have the drop section. The cab was raised up to give more room for exhaust to run between the cab and the transmission, and allowed them to raise the fuel tanks and the battery box up and give you more ground clearance. Initially, the C500 received the suffixes the same as everything else. They were most were C524s. There were some C523s as well. That's basically the only two I've ever seen, but they retained the suffix. After 74, they dropped the suffix, and it looked like this. At the end of 1975, they decided their construction trucks should all look alike. So they redesigned the C500 front end so it would match the Brute. Front axle still set forward a little bit the way it was on the original design, but the hood, radiator, fender assembly was all updated to more look like the Brute. It still had straight frame rails. You could still use a front mount PTO, and it was quite strong. You could get these trucks with heavy front axles as well. Almost at the same time they redesigned the C500, they kind of spruced up the inside of the W900 cab. In early 1975, they moved the radio up to the roof. It had been down by your right leg below the dash in the, I believe they call that the lower dash panel. Had been located there, and they decided you're having to look down to see, switch your radio channels and adjust the volume. Let's put it up in the header so you're looking up through the windshield. That'll be safer. So they moved the radio up. For a while, there was just a blank panel there where the radio had come from, but in early 1976, they redesigned the air conditioner control and that entire lower dash panel, and it provided a little more leg room for your right leg, moved the ashtray over, gave you a larger, some say easier to use air conditioner heater control panel, and it gave you a little better distribution of your air through this plastic ducting system. All that was done in January 1976. June 1976, something that anyone who was around then remembers, and that's the introduction of the VIT 200. As I said before, sales had really been slumping with all of the price hikes and the government mandates and all the things they were having to do with trucks. They were trying to come up with some way to get people to come into the dealer and look at a truck and maybe buy it, buy a Kenworth. This was their idea. They tested out aerodynamics. That was, fuel prices had been skyrocketing in the early 70s. Fuel economy was a big concern, and one way to get fuel economy was with aerodynamics. At that point, nobody had a sleeper that looked like this. So they marketed this as aerodynamic. It had 2 beds, so you could take your co-driver with you, and you never had to get a hotel room. You could just stay right in the sleeper. Had a portable toilet. It had 110 volt power on the inside. This was just the epitome of what the future of trucking was going to be. Little did they know that's actually what the future of trucking has become, but this was the beginning of that with the VIT 200. And to mask what all they were doing and help draw people into the dealership, they did it up to celebrate the country's 200th anniversary. They called it the bicentennial model, painted it red, white, and blue. And for when you come into the dealership, they even had a record that they were issued to play on days that were the open houses when you were displaying these trucks. And one side, it had a little catchy tune about what a good truck the VIT 200 was, and you flip it over and they give you all the benefits of it, except the price. Here's a line of VIT 200s at the factory. It's kind of commonly assumed that the frames were gold and all the cabs were painted the same way. I had always thought that until researching that article, and I discovered this picture from the factory. My wife tells me I'm colorblind, but that frame is not gold. And there's some other pictures taken the same day. Their frames are not gold. There were a number of these trucks built with blue frames, not gold. So I certainly learned something in researching that, and not all VIT 200s had gold frames. As you can see here, the portable toilet sitting on the bottom, they were really proud of that because you could stay in your sleeper, as the gentleman there on the right is doing, pouring his coffee, using that bottom bunk as like a couch to just recline. He's standing up, putting his clothes on. He's got his TV. He's ready to go. He can stay there all weekend waiting on his load going back the other way, and he's not having to spend money on a hotel. That was intended to help you decide to spend $50,000 on this truck, because that was the list price of a VIT 200 was right around $50,000, give or take $2,000. They had a limited number of options as far as engine, transmission, rear axles. All had torsion bar suspension. All but one had a 12.513. You get a Cummins NTC 350, California spec NTC 350, 3406 TA, PCTA, or a Detroit 8V92 TTA 430 horsepower. Those were your engine choices. And if you wanted the VIT 200 package over a standard VIT, it was appropriately $1,776 more. And they only built 42 of these. I counted, and I know there are people out there that say 50, 100, 10, all sorts of different numbers. There were 42 chassis numbers that actually relate to real trucks that came out of the Seattle factory. There were other numbers. They blocked off 100 numbers. 58 of them weren't used, 42 were trucks, became trucks. They all had this little plaque on the glove box that said Kenworth, specially constructed in tribute to America's 250th birthday, 1776. That's typically worn off, and some people will put a number there and they say these trucks are numbered, or they would have a state name there. Neither one of those are true. That's exactly what every plaque said. The dealer may have put whatever he wanted to on there, but they all said this right here. Earlier we talked about the pricing of the engines and including the hood and how that worked. You can see here the base price for a W900 along the left side and how it kind of increased along the way, and how the price of the engines increased. It's kind of interesting that in 1969, a 1693T set you back $2,500, but in 1974, it was down to $2,238. That was because everybody wanted one. They were selling a lot of them. They lowered the price so it would be the same price as a 350 Cummins, which that was brought around by not having to have the long hood. Alice Chalmers, you could get 385 net horsepower, which the one they advertised as being 450, for only $4,435. Or you could get a 400 horsepower 12V71 for $6,400, or a 1693 TA 425 horsepower for $5,500. So the pricing on the engines, you were paying for power. And you can see down in 1976, the price of a 12V71 was up to $10,349 additional. Do you think they wanted to keep putting 12V71s in W900s? No, because there was an 8V92 to replace it that was much cheaper, didn't have the long hood, wasn't as heavy. So if we're going to keep that option around, we're going to jack the price up so nobody will want to do it. And that's essentially what happened through the years. Here around 1978, 1979, they started charging for the long hood option, around $500 to put a long hood on the trucks that were available with it. Prior to that, it had been a no-charge option, but you actually had to specify your hood. They put a code number for that. Glider kits were around for a pretty long time. That's not really a lot of people think that's a modern thing, glider kit, but they were around back about 1965, 66 at least, maybe even before that. But you can see the prices were much lower for the glider kit because you were getting a truck, less engine, transmission, rear axles. And you can see here the hood prices for the glider. If you got a long wide hood, it was $579. But if you wanted a narrow hood, which were still available right up to the end of production, you could save $57 and 12 pounds of weight. And if you ever wondered, an extended hood as we know it, or a long hood as Kenworth referred to it, added 30 pounds of weight. So you could eat at a few more buffets if you didn't have the long hood. The Aerodyne design that had come out with the VIT 200 in 1976 disappeared for 3 years. There was no Aerodyne option for 77, 78, and then in 1979, they decided there was enough customer desire to purchase something like this, not a special edition, just a regular truck. So 1979, they started offering it again. You can see the bunks folded up here. He's using his lower bunk as a sofa again. They actually called this little area where the television is sitting, they actually called that a TV shelf. And they removed the portable toilet and installed a factory refrigerator. Probably a lot more handy to have the refrigerator there in certain instances, maybe not in others. You had the vista windows in the top, so the guy that was laying on the top deck, on the top bunk, could see out, see the scenery, or if he wasn't really sleepy, if he was just laying up there relaxing, he could look out at the world around him. Those were always tinted, so they didn't let too much sun in when you were trying to sleep during the daytime. The Gold Nugget was another special edition they came up with, again to kind of stimulate sales. And this was a package, it's kind of different because it was a package for the Splendor interior trucks. It wasn't intended to be the high-end VIT. It was something you could do to make a lower cost Splendor truck be special. All of the Gold Nugget trucks used a 36-inch sleeper. This was a Splendor interior, not a VIT. They used this kind of Western theme pattern. You had a somewhat limited number of engine options. They were typically higher horsepower, 34.6 PCTA or DITA Caterpillar, NTC 350, 400 Cummins, 8 V92. They all came in this paint color, but you could kind of switch up your design. And they actually numbered these trucks. They weren't built as one block. They were mixed into 80 and 81 year production. So you just ordered this special package and they would number it and build it and send it out to you. You had this plaque. It's very, very hard to figure out how many of these trucks were built because they are scattered amongst all of the other records. You'd have to look through thousands of records, 81 and 82, to pick out all of the Gold Nuggets. So at this point, there's not a known number of these that were produced, but less than 500, I think maybe 300 or so. The number 300 exists, maybe a little higher than that, but certainly limited numbers. 1981, once again, changed the panel below the dash. The main reason for that was moving the air conditioning and heat control over closer to the driver, and they added what was called a push button control. In case you have one of these and have issues with it, that was made by Red Dot. Good luck getting any parts for it. Had the temperature, the thermostat slide on the top where you adjusted from cool to heat, and then had different buttons that you pressed for outside heat, defrost, floor, or whatever. They redesigned that entire panel. It was made of fiberglass now. Kenworth didn't like using the term plastic to refer to fiberglass. When they first came out, that was what they wanted to call it. Later years, they said that was a derogatory term, referred to it as fiberglass. So this is a fiberglass panel that may or may not have held up particularly well. April 1982 was kind of the winding down of W900A production. Over the Christmas holidays of between 81 and 82, they moved most of the production tooling from Seattle to Kansas City, and the vast majority, I hesitate to say all, but the vast majority of W900As built during 1982 were from Kansas City, not Seattle. Seattle had to tool up and build the W900B, which was going to be coming out very soon, and they didn't have time to be building W900As. Here on the right top corner, this is an open house picture, 1982 from the Kansas City plant. This is spring of 1982. You'll notice they had some off-highway trucks, and they also had a couple of W900As. Check out the one on this side, long hood with a VariShield on top. That's quite an oddball right there. I'd really like to see the rest of that truck and what became of it. Nice paint job, Alcoa wheels, gull wing bumper. Obviously it was a day cab though for having the VariShield on top of the cab as opposed to the top of the sleeper. So the replacement for the W900A rolled off the assembly line, the first one, March 15th, 1982. Kenworth was really proud of this revision. They had spent thousands of engineering hours completely redesigning the cab, updating the hood, updating the frame. Lots of things changed with the W900B. The very first one rolled off the assembly line March 15th, 1982. If you notice here on the top of this little cardboard sign that they made for this first truck, thank you, Mr. Russ Wilcoxon, for this picture. He was a Seattle test driver for a number of years, and he had the pleasure of driving this truck. Chassis number 310,000. Why in the world would you pick an odd number like 310,000? The A's were at 199,000 or 198,000 some odd. Why jump to that? Well, the K100s were used in the 200,000 series, so we could go to 300,000. Well, no, we can't do that because the low cab forward trucks started at 300,000 back in 1971. So they built less than 10,000 of those low cab forwards. They skipped ahead to 310, and that's where conventional production started March 15th, 1982. From 310 back to 300,000 with the low cab forward trucks. From there on forward were regular conventionals. Here's some of the changes that the W900B had. Aside from the cab being wider and deeper as far as providing you more leg room, they completely redesigned the instrument panel. The little tricks that they had been doing with the under the dash panel in 1981, if you notice here it turns up with the air conditioning panel right beside the accelerator in the W900B. They were testing driver acceptance to moving the air conditioner panel over there. We just didn't know it at the time. The gauges, the dash panels were all redesigned, the way the gauges were retained. Everything about the instrument panel was redone. On the A's, you'd had a circuit breaker panel, sometimes gave trouble that was inside your switch panel inside the dash. On the B, they went to a fuse block and they mounted it on the inside of the firewall so it was easy to reach right under the dash panel there in front of the clutch to switch out your fuses if you needed to. They also provided breakers and relays, completely redesigned the electrical system as well at the same time. While making the cab longer, they also changed the angle of the toe board in an effort to lessen driver strain on the feet and the legs. To make the cab quieter, they moved the air conditioner, the blower motor and the air conditioner components from inside the cab to the outside of the firewall. Also to make the cab quieter, they moved the wiper motor from inside to outside. At the same time, they adopted these pantograph style wipers that actually would stay parallel as they went out and came back, as opposed to the old style that just flopped back and forth. So all of these things were viewed as major advancements over the W900A. They also collected all of the air fittings into and out of the cab in a central location in the same way with all the electrical plugs. Two main plugs on the left side of the cab for all the wiring going in and coming out. The bottom of the cab on the A's had been plywood. The idea had been the front section was easily removable. It was right in front of the seats. If you needed to access the exhaust top of the transmission, airlines. You could take your floor mat up, remove that portion of the floorboard, put it back in, everything was lovely. On the B, they went to an all aluminum floorboard and they provided 2 access panels. The access panels also doubled as the seat mounting point. So the seat mounted to this plate, you took the bolts out of the plate, and you could take the seat and the plate out as one unit, and you had an open hole to access the same items that you could get to by taking the front section of the floorboard out of the A. B was much simpler, much easier to use. The front frame horns, which had been an issue on the A, particularly with 3406 applications, the way the flange was cut away, to remedy that, they made it a Z shape instead of a channel shape. So the frame horns on a B, Z shape, that eliminated having to cut the flange off to miss the water pump or the oil cooler, and provided a lot more strength. At the same time, they offered them as the 1/4 inch thick, which had been what was on the A. They also offered 3/8, which was a heavier duty version. They changed to a stamped steel radiator support, raised the radiator up some. At the same time, they raised the engine up, so it was a little easier to get to the starter and air compressor components on the side of the engine. But we're not quite through with the A's. We thought we were, but we weren't. Believe it or not, not everyone was particularly thrilled with the new W900B. One important matter was they no longer had the long hood option. You could only get the standard hood. So no more 3408. Fitting a KTA was kind of shoehorned with Vaseline and feeler gauges. And a few guys got together and fussed at their dealers enough, and they said, you know, we've got enough parts sitting at Kansas City, we can build some glider kits. So approximately 15, give or take, glider kits were built in Kansas City. Not all were long hoods. There were a couple of short hoods involved, or standard hoods involved. And if you notice, the Bs started with 310,000, and here is a W900A GL, and its chassis number is 315193. We know this is a long hood because Kenworth had adopted the metric system at this point. That's 2,502 centimeters or 98.5 inches front axle to back of cab. On our chassis record, that's the way you identify a long hood, is having the 98.5 front axle to back of cab measurement. There's no other notation elsewhere on having a long hood. You can look on your chassis record right there and pick it up immediately though. This particular truck was sold through the dealer in Birmingham, Alabama. I've heard some stories about the guy that purchased it, was a produce hauler that wanted a 3408 and couldn't get one, and he raised enough fuss that he got one of those gliders that they built. There are actually quite a few of these that still survive. You find them around different locations. And believe it or not, this little guy standing over here on the left side, that was me in 1985. That particular truck right there is the first W900A I ever had any contact with. My dad wanted a dump truck, something that he could run around home, get off the road while I was young. So he bought this as a solid white road tractor with torsion bar suspension, 180-inch wheelbase. And he told me at the time, and I'm this size right here, I'm 7 years old, said, well, we're gonna build a dump truck out of it. We did. He and I did. And I don't mean I was sitting there. I mean, I helped drill holes, I tightened bolts, I ran that impact wrench, taking things apart. And I asked him one day, Daddy, does this wrench go the opposite direction? Does it tighten the bolts up too? Or are we gonna have to get another one? Are we gonna have this one broke? But we built this truck in the shop in a few months' time, had the dump body put on it. By that time I was hooked, so as I was a little bit older, I wanted my own truck. And this long hood here on the right was built from parts from the junkyard. We bought a new hood, new grill work, a new bumper, lights, that type thing. Everything else was from parts out of the junkyard, and we assemble this. That other kids played baseball and football and what have you. I came home and worked on my truck. And when I was in the 11th grade, we'd got it completed, and I got to drive it around a little bit. Dump trucking went south. We took the dump body off, put a fifth wheel on it and a sleeper, ran it cross country hauling cattle for a number of years. And then it was wrecked right at the house, but fortunately, I have all the parts, and it's in the shop now being put back together. It'll be a highway tractor again, and that'll be my daily driver.
What's it brought for power?
Small cam Cummins. It originally was an Alice Chalmers truck that had been repowered by Cummins, and they had done a good job as far as changing the mounts out the way they should, and that's the way we kept it with the Cummins in it. And when I put it back together, it'll most likely have a Cummins in it. Right at the last year that we ran it cross country, we actually put a 12.7 liter 60 series Detroit in it. And that was before that was a thing. We were quite unusual to pull up somewhere with a extended hood Kenworth with a 60 series in it. Caused a lot of people to scratch their heads, but we got extremely good fuel mileage and never broke down, knock on wood, and had a good lightweight as well. So I have nothing bad to say about a 60 series. I run a 14 liter every day, 575 horse, and have nothing bad to say about it, but it'll most likely get a Cummins just for simplicity. All right, that's all of my slides. Any questions? Yes, sir.
You mentioned that if you had a truck if we had found a truck of interest, let you know about it, and you could look up the history on the truck?
I can certainly give it a try. From 68, 69 through 77, yes, I can look it up.
How do you look it up?
Microfilm. I can look up the chassis record, find the dealer it came from, who it was ordered by, that type thing. After that, I have to rely on friends at dealers and Packer archives and that type thing to get records that way, but in those years, I can look them up myself. I actually have those.
So don't try this at home, just call you.
Pretty much. I don't mind a bit. My dad always said, if you have skill or knowledge, it is completely useless if you don't share it. And I've taken that to heart. He always would help anyone that came along. I try to be the same way. If somebody needs help and genuinely appreciates it, I'll do anything in the world for them. So if I can help you, just let me know. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
What year was a grill dancer introduced?
1971.
Thank you.
They, when the initial air conditioner under the dash was put in, the combo system on the 239 cab, they put an evaporator on the top that didn't work particularly well. They put one in front of the radiator for a little while, and they thought, we got all this extra space in front of the radiator, why don't we incorporate it into the grill? So the combo was first, the grill denser came shortly after.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
W900B, when was the last year that they made them?
83.
No,
The complete trucks?
complete trucks.
82, April 82. The A's and the B's overlapped for a little over a month. And then, of course, you'd see them sitting on the lot together. But Kansas City was building A's up through the end of April at least. Again, I don't have direct access to those records, so I just have to sit there and ask, well, how about look this one up? We'll look up the one after that. We'll look up the one after that. And I've made it to April, and we've got to a lot of blanks, meaning when you look the number up, there's nothing there. So that was a number that was never applied to a truck. They never built the truck, so we're right at the end. It's the end of April 82 is a good time. I don't have the exact date or the last truck. One day I will, but pretty close there. Yes, sir.
Do you know about how many extended cowl Kenworths they built?
As far as counting them, it's hard to do because there are so many records, but roughly The samples that I have taken through the years that they built them, it's pretty uniform, 3%, roughly 3%. So, however many trucks they built during that time period, 3 out of every 100 were extended cows. Whenever you start looking at the old pictures, they're actually more common than you think. Yes, sir.
What year was that fiberglass sun visor?
Fiberglass sun visor came with the second generation cab. The first generation cab had a steel sun visor on it. They tried to put that on the second generation cab for a little while, the Dash 220 series cab. They did that for a little while, and it provided a lot of stress on the top of the cab, the fiberglass roof, and they came up with a fiberglass one that was lighter. Initially, it interfered with the mirror arm, and you'll see them in 66 that have a notch in the fiberglass sun visor for the mirror arm. Then they relocated the mirror arm, and it's a full-size visor. So right there, 65, thereabouts. And then there was a couple of versions of it. Yes, sir.
The door mounted mirrors an option or standard?
They were standard through 72. You could get the cab mounted with the 239 cab, which debuted in April 69. You could get cab mounted or door mounted for that period of time, from 69 through 72. As you got closer to 72, you saw fewer and fewer of the door mounted mirrors. People really liked the cab mounted idea, and that's why they just eliminated it as option 73. Yes, sir. In the back.
I've got a W900. It's a 75 made in Chillicothe in 74.
Yes, sir.
How do I go about determining, one, how many of those W912s are made, if at all, or secondly, would the W912, for example, be a catch-all since it's got torsion bar, 38,000-pound rears, and set-back front axle?
Do you happen to know your chassis number?
Yes, sir. Have it exactly.
What is it?
I got the book right here.
Does it start with 150,000?
100 what?
150,000.
142441.
Okay.
That's what this is.
Okay. Chillicothe plant. Let me talk about that for just a second, and I'll cover yours. Chillicothe plant opened in 1974. They brought down some partly assembled W900s from Seattle, set them up in the building, and said, y'all figure out how to put these together. And that's what they did. The first 50 trucks they built were serial number 150,000 through 150,049. Then they reverted back to, that was completely out of sequence. That was 2 years ahead of sequence. They picked those numbers out. They reverted back to the 140,000 series, which is where they were at in 1974 at Seattle, and they decided we'll put an S on the end of Seattle trucks, a K for Kansas City, and I believe a C for Chillicothe. So that's where Chillicothe started building trucks. As far as an S12 that late is a little odd. You should have cowl-mounted breathers with the split fender hood. Breather still under the hood. Okay, well, right in that range, toward the end of 74, they split the fenders. You could have cowl-mounted breathers and changed it a little bit. An S12 is quite odd for most people in most parts of the country. Some areas they were quite popular. Unfortunately, they're numbered right along with everything else. C500s, everything that was a conventional used that numbering system that started with a number 1. So the only way to know is look at every single record and see what it is. Some things, like the bicentennials, I have done that. My wife and I have sat there and I'd tell her, this is so-and-so, it went here. She had a database, she'd put it in it. We spent several nights doing that. And we've done that on other things. We did that for the Chillicothe trucks for Kenworth so they could possibly find one of their first 50. That's why I asked you what the number was. They're still looking for one of the first 50, but they weren't sure what the numbers were. So we found them and identified them for them. Anybody else? Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
You mentioned yesterday about the plastic headliner
Yes, sir.
not available for the cab over.
That was David Eichelbaum, but yes, sir.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Hopefully we don't look alike. But it's okay. Kenworth all runs together.
The plastic headliner for the conventional, he mentioned that there was, when someone had replicated the vacuum
Yes.
molded plastic.
Yes, you can get a plastic one. That material was called Cycolac, by the way.
It is available.
Yes.
And we're not talking about the fiberglass one that is.
No, we're talking about the plastic one. The day cab company offers a vacuum form Cycolac plastic one, and depending on which parts man you get and whether they're having a good day or not, they're available through Kenworth. That's where I've always bought mine from, is through Kenworth. Yes, sir. The fiberglass one, some people say they're better because they don't flex the way they go in. Some people like them better, some people don't like them as well. It's just a matter of choice, but you can get the plastic one through the day cab company, or if you actually take the part number off the Cycolac headliner to Kenworth, there's a good chance they can get it for you. Yes, sir. Anybody else? I'm sorry y'all are having to stand up. I've been the chair running guy all weekend, and I would have went and got you some chairs. Sorry about that.
We're waiting for the next one.
Okay. All right. Yes, sir. One more.
There's a truck out on a lot that's a split door 36-inch sleeper, and the front corners are cut out for the mufflers. You know anything about that?
EPA was pushing sound regulations in 74, 75 era. That was when you started to see fan clutch fan controls. Fan generated a lot of noise. On high horsepower engines, KT450, 8V92, created a lot of noise. They put 10-inch mufflers on them trying to quieten them down. At that, for a particular point there in 74, 75, 76, they hadn't thought about moving the sleeper back. The only way to keep the sleeper as close to the cab as possible for length laws and be able to reach your grab handle to get in the cab and have the door open was indent the front of the sleeper, sit the mufflers back 1 inch so they would clear. So those were trucks with 10-inch mufflers on them, had the indented sleeper corners. Yes, sir. I appreciate y'all coming, appreciate y'all listening, hoping you learned something.